Okay, how's it going, everybody? So, we are going to read some more Jenny Marx uh, from her articles on the Irish question. This is article number 3, written in London, March 16th, 1870. Let's go ahead and get into this. Let's see. The main event of the past week has been O'Donovan Ross's letter, which I communicated to you in my last report. The Times printed the letter without comment, whereas the Daily News published a commentary without the letter. Quote, as one might have expected, in quote, it says, quote, Mr. O'Donovan Rossa takes as his subject the prison rules to which he has been subjugated for a while, end quote. How atrocious this, quote, for a while, end quote, is in speaking of a man who has already been in prison for 5 years and condemned to hard labor for life. Mr. O'Donovan Rossa complains, among other things, quote, of being harnessed to a cart with a rope tied around his neck, end quote, in such a way that his life depended on the movements of English convicts, his fellow prisoners. But exclaims the Daily News, quote, is it really unjust to put a man in a situation where his life depends on the acts of others? When a person is in a car or on a steamer, does not his life also depend on the acts of others, end quote. After this brilliant piece of arguing, the pious casuist reproaches O'Donovan Rossas for not loving the Bible and preferring the Irish people, a comparison which is sure to delight its readers. Quote, Mr. O'Donovan, it continues, quote, seems to imagine that prisoners serving sentences for seditious writing should be supplied with cigars and daily newspapers, and that they should above all have the right to correspond freely with their friends, end quote. Ho ho, virtuous Pharisee. At last you have admitted that O'Donovan Rossa has been sentenced to hard labor for life for seditious writing, and not for an attempted assassination of Queen Victoria, as you vilely insinuated in your first address to the French press. Quote, after all, end quote, this shameless newspaper concludes, quote, O'Donovan Rossa is simply being treated for what he is, that is, an ordinary convict, end quote. After Mr. Gladstone's special paper, here is a different angle from the liberal press, the Daily Telegraph, which generally adopts a rougher manner. Quote, if we condescended, it says, to take note of O'Donovan Ross's letter, it is not because of the Fenians who are incorrigible, but exclusively for the well-being of France. Let it be known that only a few days ago in the House of Commons, Mr. Gladstone was a formal denunciation of all these outrageous lies, and there cannot be any intelligent Frenchman of whatever party and class who would dare doubt the word of an English gentleman, end quote. But if contrary to expectation, there were parties or people in France perverse enough not to believe the word of an English gentleman such as Mr. Gladstone, France would not at least resist the well-meant advice of Mr. Levy, who is not a gentleman, and who addresses you in the following terms. Quote, we advise our neighbors, the Parisians, to treat all the stories of cruelties committed on political prisoners in England as 80 many insolent lies, end quote. Without Mr. Levy's permission, I will give you a new example of the value of the words of the gentlemen who make up Gladstone's cabinet. You will remember that in my first letter I mentioned Colonel Richard Burke, a Fenian prisoner who has gone insane thanks to the humanitarian methods of the English government. The Irishman was the first to publish this news, after which Mr. Underwood sent a letter to Mr. Bruce, the Home Secretary, asking him for an inquiry into the treatment of political prisoners. Mr. Bruce replied in a letter which was published in the English press and which contained the following sentence. Quote, with regard to Richard Burke at working prison, Mr. Bruce is bound to refuse to make an inquiry on the grounds of such ill-founded and extravagant insinuations as those contained in the extracts from the Irishman, which you have sent me, end quote. This statement by Mr. Bruce is dated January 11th, 1870. Now, in one of its recent issues, the Irishman has published the same minister's reply to a letter from Miss Berry, Richard Burke's sister, who asked for news about her brother's alarming condition. The ministerial reply of February 24th contains an official report dated January 11th, in which the prison doctor and Burke's special guard state that he has become insane. Thus, the very day when Mr. Bruce publicly declared the information published by the Irishman to be false and ill-founded, he was concealing the irrefutable official proof in his pocket. It should be mentioned, incidentally, that Mr. Moore, an Irish member in the House of Commons, is to question the minister of the treatment of Colonel Burke. The Echo, a recently founded newspaper, takes an even stronger liberal line than its companions. It has its own principle, which consists of selling for 1 penny, whereas all the other newspapers cost 2 pence, 4 pence, or 6 pence. This price of 1 penny forces it on the one hand to make pseudo-democratic professions of faith so as not to lose its working-class subscribers, and on the other hand to make constant reservations in order to win over respectable subscribers from its competitors. In its long trade on O'Donovan Ross's letter, it finished up by saying that, quote, perhaps even those Fenians who have received an amnesty will refuse to believe the exaggerations of their compatriots, end quote. As if Mr. Kickham, Mr. Costello, and others had not already published information on their suffering in prison totally in accordance with Ross's letter. But after all its subterfuge and senseless evasions, the Echo touches on the sore point. The publications by the Marseillais, it says, will cause a scandal, and the scandal will spread all around the world. The continental mind is perhaps too limited to be able to discern the difference between the crimes of a Bamba and the severity of a Gladstone. So it would be better to hold an inquiry, and so on. End quote. The Spectator, a liberal weekly which supports Gladstone, is governed by the principle that all genres are bad except the boring one. This is why it is called, in London, the Journal of the Seven Wise Men. After giving a brief account of O'Donovan Rossa and scolding him for his aversion to the Bible, the Journal of the Seven Wise Men pronounces the following judgment. Quote, the Fenian O'Donovan Rossa does not appear to have suffered anything more than the ordinary sufferings of convicts. But we confess that we should like to see changes in this regime. And it is very right and often most advisable to shoot rebels. It is also right to deprive them of their liberty as the most dangerous type of criminals. But it is neither right nor wise to degrade them. End quote. Well said, Solomon the Wise. Finally, we have the Standard, the main organ of the Tory party, the Conservatives. You will be aware that the English oligarchy is composed of two factions, the landed aristocracy and the plutocracy. If in their family quarrels one takes the side of the plutocrats against the aristocrats, one is called a liberal or even radical. If on the contrary one sides with the aristocrats against the plutocrats, one is called a Tory. The Standard calls O'Donovan Ross's letter an apocryphal story, probably written by A. Dumas. Quote, why, it says, did the Marseillais refrain from adding that Mr. Gladstone, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Lord Mayor were present each morning while O'Donovan Rossa was being tortured, end quote. In the House of Commons, a certain member once referred to the Tory party as the stupid party. It is not a fact that the Standard well deserves its title as the main organs of the stupid party. Before closing, I must warn the French not to confuse the newspaper rumors with the voice of the English proletariat, which, unfortunately, for the two countries, Ireland and England, has no echo in the English press. Let it suffice to say that more than 200,000 men, women, and children of the English working class raised their voices in Hyde Park to demand freedom for their Irish brothers, and the General Council of the International Working Men's Association, which has its headquarters in London and includes well-known English working leaders among its members, has severely condemned the treatment of Fenian prisoners and come out in defense of the rights of the Irish people against the English government. P.S. As a result of the publicity given by the Marseillais to O'Donovan Ross's letter, Gladstone is afraid that he may be forced by public opinion to hold a parliamentary public inquiry into the treatment of political prisoners, in order to avoid this again. We know how many times his corrupt conscience has opposed it already. This diplomat has just produced an official but anonymous denial of the facts quoted by Rossa. Let it be known in France that this denial is nothing more than a copy of the statements made by the prison jailer, police magistrates, Knox and Pollock, etc. These gentlemen know full well that Rossa cannot reply to them. He will be kept under stricter supervision than ever, but I shall reply to them in my next letter with facts, the verification of which does not depend on the goodwill of jailers. Okay. So yeah, this is that is the third article of the articles on the Irish question by Jenny Marx. So thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Medium. All these are Marxists. Also YouTube. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Thank y'all for tuning in. Y'all have a great day, and do that, goy.